Okay. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. So we talked a lot about memory. So I'm about to make you all a memory right now. My presentation is called An Attempt at Seditious History, Reimagining Women Through the Archives of the Ghadr Movement. I want to preface it with this quote from Frantz Fanon. For us who are determined to break the back of colonialism, our historic mission is to authorize every revolt, every desperate act, every attack aborted or drowned in blood. For the British colonial empire, history was a tool that worked for and with the regime of power. The historical texts that were written by colonial administrators about the Ghadr movement were constructed in order to stake a claim upon the history of the colonized, to occupy it, to shape it, and render it in colonial terms. Colonize it in order to more completely colonize India. These texts are often used uncritically today as sources for histories of the Ghadr movement. It seems that the seams of the patchwork quilt of Indian history have been sewn together by the colonizer, and that if these seams cannot be undone and redone by us, then this quilt will never keep us warm. The attempt of this work at seditious history then can be interpreted in two ways. First is presenting a history of a seditious movement, and second as presenting a history that is seditious due to its placing of women at the center of a movement that is usually depicted as male-dominated. I draw on archival material primarily from the Bancroft Library, the largest archive of primary resource materials on the movement in the U.S., as well as on its holes and gaps, in order to argue that the literary figure and the physical body of women were essential for the birth and sustenance of the Ghadr movement. First, I will examine how the perception and construction of Ghadr revolutionaries as feminine by the British Empire and the U.S. was what made the Ghadris threatening. Secondly, I will examine how the bodies of three women reveal how race and class as well as gender denied them each access to full participation in the movement. The silencing of these women and the limitations on their movement is reflected in the way that the archive silences and fragments their voices. This silencing can be paralleled with the way that the Ghadr movement is seen in larger narratives of Indian nationalism. Finally, I will examine a poem that reflects how the spirit of revolution for the Ghadris was a feminine spirit. So I'm not going to summarize the Ghadr movement. There's three stages. I was going to, but I think I'm going to run out of time. So basically, the first stage was radicalization and return back to India to foment revolution, but ended in trial and arrest. The second involved the transports of arms and munitions, but those were seized, and that also failed. Then the third one in 1919 was about forming communist organizations in Punjab. The British governor of Punjab, Michael O'Dwyer, who wrote at length about the movement, describes it as, quote, by far the most serious attempt to subvert British rule in India. Between 1858 and 1910, Punjab became the garrison state of the British Empire because many peasants joined the military for financial reasons. These peasants then migrated to America and composed the core of what would become the Ghadr movement. The historians Metcalfe and Metcalfe explain how the British identified various populations, particularly Sikhs, as, quote, martial races, whom they believed had the innate physical and moral characteristics that made them the best fighters. Masculinity was thus inherent to the martial races discourse and used to define the, quote, perfect colonial subject. By contrast, femininity was seen as the territory of weaker beings who used words as weapons because they did not possess inherent force. Anti-colonial nationalists, then, such as the Ghadris, whose words were more plentiful in supply than their weapons, were thus defined by this discourse as feminine in order to delegitimize them. Along these lines, O'Dwyer wrote that the Sikhs of the Ghadr movement had, quote, renounced many of the essential Sikh practices and were bringing disgrace on the Sikh name. For O'Dwyer, the Ghadr revolutionaries were not true Sikhs anymore, not because they violated tenets of Sikhi, but because they refused to be loyal. For the colonist, who believed he had constructed the loyal colonial Sikh soldier, a Sikh could not exist without the colonizer because a Sikh owed his existence to the colonizer. I use his here because in the colonial eye, women could not possibly be Sikhs due to their perceived inability to serve the colonial regime. Thus, the Sikhs of the Ghadr movement debunked expectations of loyalty and came to be regarded as, quote, bearded women by the British. The femininity assigned to them was thus the essential part of what made them revolutionary. Similar to the way that the revolutionary was perceived as feminine by British colonial discourse, the immigrant was perceived as feminine by U.S. nationalist discourse. The trope of the, quote, effeminate Hindu invader was used to depict immigrants from India as a harmful disease that would afflict the U.S. body politic. The turban is one gendered element of the Sikh immigrant identity, which, according to Jasbir Puad, profoundly troubles and disturbs American national imaginaries and their attendant notions of security. In a 1910 article entitled The Tide of Turbans, pictured here, the author writes about a, quote, son of India who, wishing to become a citizen of the U.S., refused to remove his turban while taking the oath and so remained a British subject. Regarding this, the salient question is, why even ask Sikhs to remove their turbans when taking the oath? What does the turban have to do with the swearing of one's fealty to the U.S.? The act of asking a man to deturban himself upon arrival necessarily compromises his ability to participate in national, thus masculine projects. When confronted with this policed entry procedure, he's presented with what looks like a choice to remove or not remove his turban. Yet this choice is an illusion. If he refuses to remove his turban, he's unassimilable. He forgoes the opportunity of full membership in the U.S. nation and is seen as remaining loyal to the colonizer, thus participating in the continuing emasculating, objectifying process of colonization. If he removes his turban, then he reveals his long feminine hair and is forced to contend with white hegemonic masculinity, ceasing to be an overt representation of the Sikh nation, again leading to his emasculation. The type of inspecting, vetting, and regulating which occurred at the site of the nation's border transformed the act of immigration itself into one of emasculinization or feminization. If the Ghadris were seen as feminine bodies by forces outside the movement, then how was the feminine body seen within the movement? I will answer this question by examining the cases of three women. The first is Agnes Smedley, a well-known white woman who was the active secretary of FFI, Friends for Freedom of India. She's pictured here, an organization that fought deportations of Ghadr revolutionaries following their trial. As the only person to have a bound volume of letters present in the archive, Smedley has more material connected to her than almost any other figure in the movement. It is important to ask why Smedley's letters survived the passage of time, were preserved in mint condition, and ended up in the archive, especially given that she herself was not involved in the movement during its heyday. Her work is centered around anti-deportation, not anti-colonialism, and she was not a colonial subject. The letters reveal that Smedley had connections with an influential lawyer who was the primary representative for the Ghadr party members in their deportation cases. Perhaps because this method of achieving change relied upon cooperation with elite political figures, it was in the interest of the state and the elite to preserve such records. The performance of this type of labor signifies the access Smedley herself had to masculinity, which was enabled by her whiteness, allowing her to open political doors. As an educated white American woman working with a group of emasculated immigrants, her whiteness worked to grant her the masculinity that came with representing the white nation. This allowed her to use the revolutionary environment cultivated by feminized immigrants and revolutionaries to perform labor usually reserved for men with men. This was a privilege that a brown woman would not have had at all in a male space in any country because the confluence of her racial and gendered identity would almost always deny her access to masculinity. In venturing outside the archive, it is possible to encounter other narratives of engagement. In a personal narrative of her life entitled Parrot Speak, Kartar Kaur Dhillon, the daughter of Sikh immigrants who arrived at the turn of the 20th century, describes how she dreamt of working actively for the India's freedom from British rule, but was stifled by her husband. She wrote that the day she signed up to take classes at the university, he accused me of wanting to be around other men. The day I was to cover a strike for the workers' paper, he asked me, and who will take care of the children if you are arrested? Here, Dhillon's husband's active exclusion of her from political action and from education is a silencing that denies her access to revolution. It also denies her access to masculinity, since becoming politically conscious as well as educated are traditionally avenues open only to men for fear that women with access to such ways will usurp male monopolies on power. The Ghadr movement was threatening to the colonial powers for the same reason that Dhillon's request was threatening to her husband. Both Dhillon and the Ghadr movement were interested in overthrowing cemented power structures. Oh, also, she's pictured in the middle on the right side. A third woman involved with the Ghadr movement was Padravati Chandra. Unlike Dhillon, though she's in the archive, her historical presence is almost completely invisible. She's often described as a wife of Ram Chandra, and this problematic relational description has never been deepened or more carefully examined. In an interview with her conducted in 1974, revolves almost entirely around her husband, and the transcription of the interview contains a number of empty spaces and gaps between words and sentences, as though the transcriber couldn't hear or didn't understand. In a few places, the transcriber wrote yakety yak, which I pointed out there. And it's seemingly trivial, but it's actually a significant commentary on whose voice is worthy of recording, hearing, and preserving. This fragmented speech is a sort of present absence and parallels the fragmented nature of womanhood for Chandra. Her movement involved going from home to home, childhood to marital, colonial India to neo-colonial U.S., and then within the U.S. from Berkeley to San Francisco, so it's a story of repeated displacement. When asked about her physical involvement with the movement, she replied that she went to the Ghadr ashram to stuff newspapers and stamp them. This revealed the gendered nature of the labor performed by Chandra in comparison to men whose labor consisted of thinking and writing. At another point in the interview, she narrates how she fed and cared for her malnourished husband in the U.S. when he was in critical condition, and thus her presence in the movement, unlike her presence in the archive, is there to fill in gaps. It is invisibilized and unacknowledged. She was used as an instrument by the movement to plug its leaky pipes. At one point in the interview, she is asked, "So after you were married, you never lived in one place?" She replies, "No, I never lived. I never had a home." This pointed remark reflects Gayatri Spivak's argument that patriarchal continuity is built on the displacement of women, echoing how colonial continuity is built on the displacement of anti-colonial revolutionaries. The movement of the Ghadris from being colonial subjects in India to immigrants in the U.S. to seditious criminals in India and then seditious criminals in the U.S. is what allowed the colonial regime to sustain itself. Applying this to the writing of history, then, the displacement of women in Ghadr historiography parallels the displacement of Ghadr in India's historiography, which continues today to both syntax both patriarchal and colonial continuity. So moving from feminine bodies, I'm going to move to the symbolic figure of the feminine in its poetry, which was highly recited on both sides of the Atlantic, and it's considered by some people to be what made it so popular. The common theme in the poetry is that of the motherland, and how we have to defend it from being raped and pillaged. But this helpless sort of notion was complicated later, and I'm going to read to you this one poem called Ghadr di Gunj Valo Sandesa, which complicates this. It presents the echo or voice of revolt, Ghadr di Gunj, as a feminine figure. So I'm going to read the poem right now. Rahin dilandi dilanu rahundi, निकल दिलां चो दिलां नू आई हां मैं चुनवे फुल परो के गदरियां ने सोना महकदा हार बनाई हां मैं कठी पाप करके दिल दी दर्दियां ने कौमी जोश दी नै वगाई हां मैं मोती छांट के संता समुंदरां दे नवां लखां दा हार सजाई हां मैं मुर्दा कौम नू फेर जगाउण वाली जीन बूटी हां गदर अक्सीर हां मैं जालम बादशाह ते लुटेरियां दे लगदी हिक ते तेज शमशीर हां मैं मददगार मजलूमां ते आजिसां दी हैंकड़बाज बेदर्दां दी पीर हां मैं दुखी दिलां नू हौसला दे करके शाद करन नू बेनज़ीर हां मैं कौमां जेड़ियां ने समझी रमज मेरी उन्हां पीता है आब हयात समझो दस्ता तेज हथियार दा हथ जिसते हथ उसते है करामात समझो नुस्खा आजमूदा जिसने वरत्या है बदे फुले है ओह दिन रात समझो गदर वदिया तबीब गुलाम दा है अगे एस लुकमान बीमात समझो मेरी आरजू करा समाज अंदर नवी रूह करके इनकलाब पैदा उल्टा तकत हुकूमतां जालिमां दे करी जालिमां कर इज़तराब पैदा अंतम साहां ते सिस्क दे इंडिया विच नवी जिंदगी करा शताब पैदा दे के हिंदियां दे हथकाज हरता नवा करदियां दुनिया च बाब पैदा नवा करदियां दुनिया च बाब पैदा. The first 8 lines of the poem are devoted to self-naming and self-asserting. Okay, I'm going to skip a little. I think I'm running out of time. The Gunj goes on to, So the Gunj is the echo voice of revolution and builds an identity from the first line where the poet reveals that the Gunj has arrived by traveling from soul to soul. And it goes on to explain how the collective unity of the Ghadris forms a feminine power, symbolized here in myriad forms, a river of strength, a garland, a necklace. The Gunj goes on to say, I am the elixir that wakes the dead communal body, the lightning-quick sword that pierces the chest of tyrannical kings, the defender of the downtrodden, the unparalleled giver of strength. Here we see the feminine form take on multiple roles, from plant to sword to elixir to defender. The first half of this poem allows the Gunj to state with unequivocal clarity who and what she is, claiming an identity. Her travel from soul to soul is no longer a displacement that drains her identity, but it's a replacement, replacing the death in her community with life. The figure of the moving woman here is an empowering one. She's one who can connect souls, who asserts her identity as both a sword that pierces oppression and an elixir that gives life. As the feminine form moves from one avatar to another, she demonstrates the function of the Gunj, that it must travel in order to exist, in order to be heard, just like a revolutionary movement. As she moves, she, the sound, becomes both movement and the movement herself. When the poem was read long ago, it would have had to require the reader, regardless of their gender, to take on the feminine persona. Thus, the reader would have to embody the voice of revolution as a woman, tying them together so one could not be without the other. This reveals that revolution, which can only reach hearts across time and space through words and poetry, is, in this case, feminine. The second half of the poem, the Guja instructs. She says that the community that understands her will be immortal, that weapons are the tools of revolution, and revolution is medicine for the enslaved. The last portion of the poem is framed using the device of birth and birthing. The Gunj desires to give 4 births: to revolution, to trouble in the home of the oppressor, to a new India, to a new chapter in history, aligning with Fanonian understandings of revolutionary consciousness that's necessarily born from violence. The poem is structured to allude to violence in the same moment it alludes to rebirth. In its embodiment as a woman, the Gunj proclaims that revolution must be born, and if revolution is seen as a living creature, then it must be born of woman. Yet it is not also a new revolution that is born, but a new history. The penultimate word in the poem, Bab, chapter, takes us back to the importance of history in relation to revolution. In conclusion, the disparate evidence presented here suggests that the construction of Ghadr revolutionaries as effeminate made the act of revolution an effeminate act. At the same time, Ghadr movement only allowed women limited access to revolutionary participation, and that access corresponded to what access they had to masculinity. And this way, it reproduced patriarchy it was itself subjected to, thus it was a target of and participant in patriarchy at the same time. This crisis parallels the crisis in its historiography, where it's silenced by larger narratives of Indian nationalist history, and it in turn silences women. So if colonial histories were and continue to be patriarchal, then the decolonial history must necessarily be feminist. In order to decolonize the historiography of the movement, we must reclaim its femininity by reading for the feminine presence, which can be read for in its poetry, which reveals that it conceived of itself as feminine and understood the figure of woman to be truly revolutionary. However, to read for the feminine presence in a university archive, which privileges the male voice, is almost an impossible task. For this reason, this research has limitations, and this photo is one of Gulab Kaur, who's a woman who's never featured in any archive. She lived in the Philippines and joined the Ghadr when her husband refused to. She abandoned him, and she made the way back to India with revolutionaries on the ship, and then while she was there, she distributed arms and literature, was captured, arrested, and tortured, and she was a revolutionary as a woman among male revolutionaries. So many histories have been written about Smedley, the woman I first presented to you, but none about Gulab Kaur. I'm almost done. Returning to Fanon's observation, then, that our historic decolonial mission is to authorize every revolt, this means that we must grant authority to revolt or revolution through authoring it, writing it, and rewriting it. This correlates with the Ghadri poet's assertion that revolution in a society, with revolution in a society, must come a revolution in history. And so we must begin to make our history seditious. Today, a little over 100 years have passed since the Ghadr movement began. If we wish to be faithful to its spirit, we must snatch our history away from the university archives, where the masculine hands of power hold it tight, and make it and remake it feminine. Thank you.